This is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast. Hey everybody, it's Tony Codespati, and this is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, Volume 48. Today it's entitled Fundamental Transformation. It's an analysis of the conflict between the Trump administration and the D.C. establishment. Well, before I even get started on that, I have to go back to the closing days of the 2008 presidential race, where Barack Obama confidently declared that we're 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. Now, these sort of hyperbolic declarations are common campaign fare, but Barack Obama was not a common candidate for president, and he was serious. Just how serious he was really didn't unfold right away. It unfolded in a step-by-step incremental manner as Obama seemed to undo the established order in Washington. And he was assisted in that effort by an expanding economic crisis. Other factors that were significant in allowing Obama room to maneuver were the fact that he had a broad Democratic majority in both House and Senate, and he had a compliant media that was just flushed with excitement and anticipation of a new president that they clearly favored. The president's race also helped him in a sense that his opponents were a little reticent in adopting a too harsh of a tone in opposing his position, lest they be labeled racist. But ironically, as it turned out anyway, they were labeled racist for having any opposition, so it didn't work. The point here is, though, that the groundwork had been set for the nation to undergo some sort of a transformation. Now, what I plan to do here is to outline both the transformation attempted and the transformation achieved, because they're really not exactly the same. And along with that, I'm going to also outline how that effort is having clear repercussions for the Trump administration. Now, I will not go into each and everything Obama did. That would be boring. It would take up too much time, and it's really too long for a forum such as a podcast. Rather, what I'd like to do instead is to tie Obama's efforts together to illustrate the strategy that this President Obama had and was taking in his work to undo our constitutional republic. Now, make no mistake, that's what transformational change means. And I've said in previous podcasts that you don't undergo a transformation of something, a fundamental transformation of anything that you love. You're transforming something fundamentally because you believe it's fundamentally flawed. And I think most Americans would object to that. I think most Americans do not believe America is fundamentally flawed. But Obama's first target after he was inaugurated, was the federal bureaucracy. Now, he intended to reorient every federal bureaucracy by politicizing and weaponizing them. To accomplish this, what he did is that he focused on the appointment of czars. If you remember, he appointed his cabinet secretaries for Senate approval, but he went one step further. He appointed czars that reported directly to him, that needed no approval from the Senate. And they went out there and they started enacting policy. And so those czars, what they did is that they would orient each department in a way that made them much more political and in many cases adversarial. Agency secretaries, like I said, were still appointed and approved by the Senate, but the czars didn't need that approval. But this wasn't unnoticed by the Senate. Robert Byrd, a Democrat, was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and he decried the practice. He felt it was out of step with constitutional order, and he was right, but he really couldn't do much about it, and so he was ignored. The agencies became staffed with political appointees and civil service titles, and step one of the fundamental transformation was done. Federal agencies carry out policy, and that is done through the regulatory process. Now, let's step back a second and try to understand what a regulation is. Generally speaking, a regulation is a construct of a federal agency. When Congress passes a law, the enforcement responsibility for that law falls on one of the federal agencies. Let's take, for example, the Treasury Department. There's a Treasury law, banking law, let's say, that goes to the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Department needs to write regulations regarding that particular law. Now, the reason why the Treasury Department needs to do that is because laws are generally written vaguely, and there's some latitude and there's some room for interpretation. And so the department, in this case, the Treasury Department, will write something that expands what the meaning of that statute is. So, in other words, it's a way to support the law with more detail of what the law actually means, and we call those regulations. Now, there's a whole process. Agencies don't do this just completely on their own. They do seek feedback from the people who are going to be affected by these regulations. So there is a process that is in place. But it's important to remember at the end of it all that a regulation isn't law, but it does have the force of law. So for all intents and purposes, it really does act like a law. So writing regulations are critically important efforts, and they can be really abused. And when they are abused, that's very problematic. Now, what did Obama have his agencies do with regulations that I object to and that was so bad? Well, for starters, Obama had agencies unilaterally claim jurisdiction without any statutory, in other words, without any legal support. You can't write a regulation unless there's a law in place, but you can't even do that if you don't have jurisdiction. If you remember, back in the Obama years, the FCC declared itself to have jurisdiction over the Internet, even though there were court decisions already then in place that said the FCC had no jurisdiction. But the FCC just ignored what the court said on Obama's say-so and began writing regulations regarding the Internet. So once you start doing that, once you start writing regulations where no law exists, now you're acting like you're the legislature. So this is what another thing Obama did. He had agencies write regulations that didn't support laws. And this occurred in the Labor Department. You may remember early in the Obama administration, in his first term, a bill came to Congress called Union Card Check, which was a union-supported effort that would more easily unionize workplaces. But it failed. It didn't pass the Congress. But didn't matter to Obama. What he did, he told his labor secretary, who's now the head of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, he told his labor secretary to go write regulations regarding unionization of work, unionization rules in workplaces, as if card check had already passed. Now, that's illegal, but Obama did it and there was no consequence for it. So that's just a brazen kind of usurpation of the legislative authority of the Congress. President can't make his own laws unilaterally, but Obama knew the Congress wasn't about to move against him, and the courts would take years to decide any case brought to challenge it. But in the meantime, the agencies had been politicized, weaponized, and fundamental transformation was well underway. So let's see where we are so far. Obama appointed czars to bypass the Senate. The czars set policy, staffed agencies with political operatives who aggressively regulated Obama's political opponents while Congress did nothing. In other words, two of the three branches of government were corrupted, and they were failing to live up to their oaths. But the courts still remained for the most part. Now, when people think of the Supreme Court under Obama, they usually recall the two crazy decisions on Obamacare that were convoluted and totally illogical. But the Supreme Court decided a lot more than that. And the Supreme Court made literally dozens of other decisions rejecting Obama's efforts at fundamental transformation. While the court was narrowly divided, deciding 5-4 on a lot of issues, there were a record number of cases, at least 20 by my count, where the decisions were 9-0, unanimous Supreme Court decisions. You would think that's rare, but in the Obama era, he set a record, something like the most unanimous decisions against the sitting administration in something like 50 or 60 years. Now, that means that Obama appointees like Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor decided against the president. Now, I'm not going to go through all 20 cases. I'll just go through a little more than a handful of them. But I want you to try to envision the kind of America Barack Obama wanted to transform our country into. There was a case called United States versus Jones. And in that case, Obama argued that the police, listen to this carefully, the police should be allowed to track your movements with a GPS device, for example, like planted in your car, without your knowledge, even if you weren't under suspicion for committing a crime. Think about what kind of a country you'd be living in if it was okay for the police to, without your knowledge, plant a GPS device on your car just because they wanted to follow you around. Who knows, for any reason or for no reason. Obama thought that was okay. The Supreme Court decided against him 9-0. In another case, Sackett versus the EPA, Obama wanted to deprive citizens of their right to appeal an adverse decision by the EPA. He wanted to discourage appeals by fining citizens $75,000 a day. In this particular case, this family, a Sackett family, built a home, and the EPA claimed that they could not build that home after it had already been built. And, of course, when you go through all the expense of building a home, you don't want the EPA to tell you now you have to tear down your home and build it somewhere else. So they wanted to appeal the decision by the EPA. EPA said, fine, but we're going to charge you $75,000 a day while you're waiting for your appeal to be heard. And that fine is payable whether you are heard or not. That's what was Obama was supporting that. Obama was supporting that. It's crazy. But that's the kind of America Obama wanted. Now, there was another case called Gabelli versus the SEC. Now, in this case, Obama wanted to dramatically extend the statute of limitations to try people for acts that were committed not just a few years ago, decades ago. So, but understand something. We're not talking about major crimes here. You know, the kind of crimes like fraud. There's no statute of limitations on fraud. So, you know, some crimes don't have statute of limitations, like murder, fraud. There are no statutes regarding that. But on lesser crimes that could still, where you could be fined to the point of bankruptcy and all those kind of things, he wanted to dramatically extend the statute of limitations on those things, which would put the government in a very powerful position, because even if there was a question of whether or not you were liable for something, after the statute of limitations is gone, you're probably going to dump all those records. But Obama wanted to change the law so the government could go after people under those circumstances so he can ruin them. Think about that. That's what Obama wanted to do. I got just a couple more. But these cases are unbelievable, and you can look them all up. There was another case called Arkansas Fish and Game Commission versus the United States. Now, in this case, the Obama DOJ argued that a federal government should be allowed to destroy your property and not have to compensate you for it. Think of, can you think about that? Think about that for a minute. If the government is allowed to destroy your property. In this particular case, what happened was the Army Corps of Engineers, federal agency, they flooded an area that destroyed a whole bunch of timber that was owned by the Arkansas Fish and Game Commission. And so the Arkansas Fish and Game Commission went to the Army Corps of Engineers and said, "Hey, look, you just destroyed our timber. You owe us for that." And they said, "Go pound sand." And they went to court, and Obama supported them to not pay the government. Now, if that would have occurred, then the government could get out of paying you for any damage they ever did to you. This is the kind of America that Barack Obama wanted. I'm laughing, but it's really not funny. There was another case called the NLRB, it's the National Labor Relations Board, versus Noel Canning. And in that case, Obama argued that he could decide when Congress was in recess in order to make a recess appointment. Now, Congress sets its own rules. Congress is a different branch of government. Obama has no authority, no right, nothing, no constitutional basis whatsoever to decide when the Congress is in session and when it isn't. That's up to Congress to decide. But Obama wanted to stack the NLRB with his guys. And so what he did is that he said, "Oh, they're in recess and I'm appointing this guy." And then every decision that was made because that guy was on the NLRB had to be reversed. See, this is the kind of monkey wrench that people like Obama, who's not a Democrat, he's not a socialist, he's a pure leftist, probably a Bolshevik, although we don't really know. But he's very far left. He is not a constitutional adherent at all. Then we have another case, Judah Lang versus Holder. Now, in this case, Obama argued that he had the latitude to apply immigration laws any way he chose. Think about that. He wanted to apply. Now, this had to do a lot with the Dreamers, and it had a lot to do with the Arizona law. So he lost this case also 9-0. And then the last case I'll tell you about is a case called Abil Hava versus the United States. In that case, listen to this. In that case, think about this, anybody out there who does any kind of illicit drugs. In this case, Obama argued that the government could charge drug buyers with the crimes that were committed by drug sellers. So just imagine that. Imagine you're just like a local high school pothead, and you go and you buy drugs, pot, off of the guy that deals it to you. He's the drug seller, and then he goes, because he's a real abuser of substances. He goes and gets into an accident where he commits vehicular homicide. You can be charged with that, according to Obama. That's the kind of country he wanted. So it sounded great when he said, "I'm looking for the fundamental transformation of the United States." But this is what he was really thinking of when he did it. And the Supreme Court stood in the way of these. Now, there are literally dozens and dozens of other cases that were decided on narrower margins. These are just the unanimous cases decided against Obama. There were many, many other cases that were decided 7-2, 5-4, 6-3. There were many other cases like that. It goes on and on. These are just 7. There are 13 others that were decided unanimously like this that I could find, and there's probably more. Now just think what kind of America this would be. Now, thankfully, he lost these cases. But when Donald Trump shocked the world and won the presidential election, all those embedded bureaucrats knew that Trump planned to change the way they did business. You see, Hillary Clinton was supposed to win. Hillary Clinton was like Barack Obama. She was a Saul Alinsky acolyte. And she was supposed to complete the transformation. that Obama started. But she didn't lose to a D.C. insider or a weak-kneed Republican who would probably capitulate to the Democrat agenda anyway. She lost to an outsider, a known personality, but an unknown political quantity, and therefore very dangerous. So Trump had to be stopped. The media, Democrats, a large portion of the GOP, and the permanent government within the federal bureaucracy saw an existential threat to their dominance and control of the central government. Prior to leaving office, Obama loosened the rules on sharing signals intelligence, vastly expanding the number of people who had access to classified data and greatly increasing the potential for leaks. Now, there was an article about this in the New York Times about how the government has vastly more people able to see classified information. This was reported by mainstream liberal media outlets. And after Trump's inauguration, it was also reported that Organizing for Action, an Obama campaign organization that changed its name, was advising current federal agency employees, many of whom who were Obama holdovers or embeds, or some of them just sympathizers, how to best thwart Trump from enacting his agenda. Now, this is very serious because that is the definition of sedition. The President of the United States, no matter what you think of him, he is the head of the federal government, the federal bureaucracies, the executive agencies. And his policy is what they are to enact, provided it's legal. Now, these agencies had gotten so used to doing things the Obama way, where Obama just unleashed them, wrote his own regulations that he wasn't supposed to write, had them write regulations they weren't supposed to write. He did so many things that were in violation of the law. These agencies over the last 8 years got very used to that, and they got very used to pushing people around. They got very used to having stronger enforcement arms. Some of them even have armed enforcement arms. It's out of control. And now they're committing sedition. Now, what President Trump is experiencing today is the result of these Obama actions. It's a complete subversion of the government. And there is really only one way to stop it. President Trump has to take swift action and legal action, aggressive action against the people responsible. He needs to conduct massive prosecutions of the Hatch Act. He has to root out the politics in the federal agencies. They're not supposed to be political, folks. He can't allow the leaks to continue. He may even need to have the former president and Secretary of State indicted. This is what Obama has given us. A federal Leviathan that would rather burn America to the ground than yield to the Constitution and the rule of law. That's it for me. Thanks for listening to this podcast of the Great Vocal Majority. I'm Tony Codispoti. Come to the website, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And I hope you got something out of this, and I'll speak to you soon. Thanks.